I did go to Diana's coffin the day after I'd written it, and I read it to her in there, and I did sort of feel a sort of...
For nearly 3 decades, Charles Spencer has been one of the quietest and most deliberately restrained figures connected to the British royal family. He has watched from Althorpe, the Spencer family estate in Northamptonshire, where Diana is buried, as his sister's memory was claimed, repurposed, commercialized, and debated by everyone from biographers to broadcasters to streaming platforms to the people Diana raised as her own children. He has said relatively little publicly throughout all of it, not because he lacked opinions, but because the man who stood at Westminster Abbey in September 1997 and delivered what many consider the most significant public speech of that decade understood something that impulsive people rarely grasp: that silence, maintained carefully and deliberately, carries more weight than reaction. When Charles Spencer finally breaks that silence, the world notices. In early 2026, he broke in a way that sent shockwaves through the Sussex camp, through Kensington Palace, and through the offices of one of the world's most powerful streaming companies. And the 4 words he reportedly used in response to a major documentary proposal were so blunt, so unambiguous, and so final that they changed the landscape of everything Harry and Meghan have been building. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand who Charles Spencer actually is and what he spent the last 28 years doing. He is the 9th Earl Spencer, 62 years old, Diana's youngest sibling, and custodian of a legacy that sits at the intersection of personal grief, royal history, and global cultural memory. When Diana died in Paris on August 31st, 1997, the question of where she would be buried was not left to the palace. Charles Spencer made that decision himself. Diana was laid to rest at Althorpe, on an island in the middle of an ornamental lake in the grounds of a home the Spencer family has owned for 500 years. The choice was not accidental. It was a statement about ownership and protection that Charles has never needed to articulate explicitly, because the decision itself said everything that needed to be said. He has kept the most intimate materials connected to his sister's private life, including personal diaries, home footage, and family archives, sealed from public access ever since. He has declined projects. He has refused interviews. He has protected the mystery of the private Diana with consistency that contrasts sharply with the constant public circulation of the public one. His eulogy at Westminster Abbey is the moment most people associate with Charles Spencer, and for good reason. Delivered in front of an audience estimated at 2 billion people, it was the most direct public challenge to the royal family that anyone in proximity to them had delivered in living memory. He promised that the Spencer blood would ensure that Diana's sons were raised with warmth and sensitivity, rather than the cold institutional rigidity that had defined their mother's experience of the Windsor world. He promised to shield them from what he described as the torture that had characterized Diana's life. Those were not rhetorical flourishes. They were commitments made in public, before the entire world, over the coffin of his sister. And the subsequent years of quiet, careful protection of Diana's legacy represent Charles Spencer attempting to honor those commitments, even when the circumstances became considerably more complicated than anyone standing at Abbey in 1997 could have anticipated. The complication that matters most to the current moment began with jewelry. When Meghan Markle appeared wearing Diana's aquamarine ring at the 2018 royal wedding reception, the gesture was received warmly by many people who interpreted it as a meaningful tribute from a new member of the family to the woman whose memory remained central to everything the family represented publicly. She wore the butterfly earrings. She wore the Cartier tank watch. She wore the gold bracelets. Each appearance of a Diana piece coincided with a major public occasion where photographs were guaranteed to circulate widely. If these were tributes, they were tributes with an audience in mind, and over time the audience began to notice the pattern. The Diana accessories were not occasional. They were consistent, strategic, and attached to the most high-profile moments of Meghan's public appearances. Whether the intent was genuine homage or something more calculated was a question that different observers answered differently, but the effect was unambiguous. Diana's image was being woven into Meghan's public identity in a way that created association between the two women in the public mind. The Oprah Winfrey interview in March 2021 sharpened that association considerably. Analysts and royal commentators noted the structural parallels between that interview and Diana's 1995 Panorama broadcast. The intimate setting, the controlled emotional disclosure, the narrative of a woman seeking help from an institution that had dismissed her cries, the direct appeal to the public over the heads of a palace that had closed every other door, whether those parallels were conscious or coincidental. They were visible enough that observers noted them immediately. For Charles Spencer, watching from Althorpe, the architecture of the Oprah interview reportedly did not feel like tribute. It felt like appropriation of a template that had been built from his sister's genuine suffering. The Netflix documentary series that followed, the confessional camera moments, the narrative of a couple forced to flee an establishment that had hunted them, all of it drew on the Diana story in ways that positioned Meghan as a contemporary version of a woman who had survived the same forces. For someone who had watched his sister's real trauma be exploited in real time by people who saw vulnerability as content, the pattern was becoming increasingly familiar and increasingly troubling. The documentary proposal that arrived in early 2026 was a moment everything reached a breaking point. The Sussex media operation was under genuine commercial pressure. The Spotify deal had already collapsed. The American Riviera Orchard lifestyle brand had not generated the traction that had been projected for it. The Netflix deal, reportedly worth $100 million across its full term, was expiring and needed to be justified by content that could demonstrate the couple's continued commercial relevance. The With Love Meghan lifestyle series had landed to reviews that ranged from lukewarm to scathing. The Times gave it 2 stars. The Guardian gave it 1 star, calling it toe-curlingly unlovable television. The Daily Telegraph described it as an exercise in narcissism. Even publications that had previously been sympathetic to Meghan's position expressed confusion about what the show was for and who it was aimed at. The streaming giant needed something significant, something that could justify continuing the relationship into a new contract period, and someone in the Sussex camp arrived at what must have seemed like an obvious answer, a major documentary marking the 30th anniversary of Diana's death in 2027. The concept made commercial sense in the most straightforward possible terms. Diana remains one of the most searched, most written about, and most emotionally significant figures in modern history. A cinematic documentary marking 30 years since the Paris Tunnel, combining emotional family history with archival material, would have generated enormous global interest. Netflix reportedly responded enthusiastically to the pitch. But the version that was being proposed was not simply a historical document. It was structured to draw an explicit parallel between Diana's experience and Meghan's, positioning Meghan as the modern continuation of Diana's story and framing both women as victims of the same institutional forces across different generations. To make that narrative work at the scale being proposed, the producers needed things that only one person could provide. They needed Althorpe itself as a backdrop. They needed private family archives. They reportedly wanted access to Diana's personal handwritten diaries and home footage that has never been publicly seen, the intimate private Diana that exists only in the sealed materials Charles Spencer has protected for nearly 3 decades. Without those materials, the documentary would be another recycling of the public record. With them, it would be something genuinely unprecedented. The proposal went to Charles Spencer. His reported response was 4 words. Is this a joke? Those 4 words, delivered by the man who has more authority over Diana's legacy than any other living person, effectively ended the project. Without Charles Spencer's cooperation, without Althorpe, without the private archives, the documentary could not be what it was designed to be. The central pillar of the proposal had been removed, and the structure collapsed around it. There's a layer of personal history in Charles Spencer's refusal that goes beyond protective instinct. Those close to him have described a specific guilt that has shaped his approach to everything connected to Diana's public image since 1997. It relates to the 1995 Panorama interview, which later investigations revealed had been obtained through methods involving forged documents and psychological manipulation of a vulnerable woman. Diana was in pain, isolated, and desperate for a platform when that interview was made. The full truth about how it was secured emerged years after the broadcast and affected Charles Spencer significantly because it was reportedly he who had introduced Diana to the journalist involved in its production. He had played a role, however unintentional and however innocent his intentions, in creating conditions for one of the most significant exploitations of his sister's pain during her lifetime, The aftermath of that revelation has informed every subsequent decision he has made about who gets access to Diana's private materials and story. When the 2026 documentary proposal arrived, what Charles reportedly saw in was a recognizable architecture. Someone using Diana's vulnerability and legacy as a vehicle for another person's commercial and narrative ambitions. His refusal was not hesitation. It was immediate and absolute. The implications of that refusal extend beyond the documentary itself and into the broader question of what the Sussex media operation can sustain without access to the Diana connection that has been one of its most consistent sources of legitimacy and public interest. The royal brand that Harry and Meghan carry derives a significant portion of its emotional resonance from association with Diana, and that association has been most powerful when it involves either Harry's own memories and grief or the specific imagery and materials that Charles Spencer controls. With Charles making clear that his cooperation is not available for projects structured in the way the 2026 documentary was structured, the Sussex operation loses access to the most emotionally powerful layer of the story it has been telling. William's position in this situation is worth understanding precisely because it illuminates why Charles Spencer's intervention carries a different weight than anything the palace itself could have done. William has been privately furious about the commercialization of Diana's image for years, a fury that those who know him well describe as genuine and deep rather than political. But William is the future king, and every action he takes carries institutional implications. He cannot publicly block his brother's media projects without generating headlines about palace censorship and royal family warfare that would create more problems than they solve. The establishment acting to suppress Harry looks like exactly what the Sussex narrative has always claimed. Diana's own brother acting to protect her legacy looks like something entirely different. It looks like family honor rather than institutional control. When Charles Spencer calls a project a joke, the story is not about royal power protecting itself. It is about a man keeping a promise he made at Westminster Abbey in 1997 in front of 2 billion people over his sister's coffin. The letter that Charles Spencer reportedly sent to Prince William, urging him to address the deepening estrangement before the silence allowed Harry and Meghan to dominate the global narrative unchecked, reveals something important about how Charles understands his role in this situation. He is not siding with Harry against William or with William against Harry. He is operating from a position that is entirely his own, the position of the man who has spent nearly 3 decades protecting something that belongs to neither brother exclusively, and that both of them carry a responsibility toward. His concern, as reported by sources close to the situation, is that the ongoing estrangement is creating a vacuum that the Sussex media operation fills with its own version of the family story, and that the longer that vacuum persists, the harder it becomes to reclaim the narrative on terms that honor what Diana actually represented rather than what she can be made to represent for commercial purposes. Diana's actual legacy, the one Charles Spencer has been protecting through 3 decades of quiet refusals and sealed archives, was built on things that had nothing to do with media strategy or streaming deals. She transformed public understanding of AIDS at a moment when the disease was defined by fear and stigma, sitting with patients and shaking hands without gloves when most people would not have entered the room. She took her sons to homeless shelters because she wanted them to understand the human cost of privilege and indifference. She used her visibility in service of landmine victims and sick children and people whose suffering was invisible to institutions that should have been addressing it. That legacy belongs to the historical record in ways that no documentary proposal can own and no streaming deal can capture. Charles Spencer knows this, and it is why he keeps the most intimate materials sealed. The private Diana is not content. She is his sister. And after everything that has happened in the years since 1997, he has decided that some things are simply not for sale.